They all laughed. My cousins, my aunt, the so-called family advisors. Every last one of them chuckled when the lawyer announced that I, Claire Whitmore, sole granddaughter of Walter Whitmore, founder of the Whitmore Hotel Group, had been left exactly $10. Not 10 million, not even 10,000, just a crisp $10 bill. Aunt Diane's painted lips curled in something between pity and satisfaction. Bradley couldn't contain himself. He actually clapped. Emma looked away, pretending to be polite, but I saw the smirk tug at her mouth. To them, it was confirmation that I had always been the disappointment. The artsy one, the stubborn one, the weird one who chose sculpting clay over spreadsheets and marble over mergers. The mahogany-paneled boardroom felt like a courtroom, and I was the public defendant being sentenced shamed for daring to live on my own terms. But I didn't flinch. Because while they laughed, I remembered my grandfather's eyes, the way they twinkled when I showed him one of my pieces in secret, how he once whispered, "There's more truth in your hands than in half the board reports I've read. I hadn't expected anything. Honestly, I almost didn't come. But I did. Out of respect. Out of unresolved grief. Out of curiosity. And just as I was gathering my things to leave, cheeks hot with humiliation, Mr. Langston, the family lawyer, cleared his throat and looked at me differently. Almost like he was waiting. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice calm but firm. "There's a private letter addressed to you, left by your grandfather. He requested I deliver it." After the reading, that moment changed everything. I never really fit in, not at family dinners, not at company retreats, not even at my own parents' wedding anniversary, which felt more like a board meeting than a celebration. Being a Whitmore meant something in New York society. The name appeared on hotel lobbies across the country, on charity gala banners, and in whispers about real estate empires and quiet political influence. But in the Whitmore family, prestige was inherited and expected to be maintained. You didn't just carry the name, you carried the brand. My cousins, Bradley and Emma, understood that from birth. Bradley was already shadowing the executive team by 15, and Emma could recite stock fluctuations better than I could remember my art history notes. They wore their ambition like armor and wielded it like a weapon. I, on the other hand, preferred worn denim, dusty fingernails, and long afternoons lost in clay and steel. My first act of rebellion was choosing sculpture over economics. The fallout was swift and brutal. "You're wasting your potential," my mother had said. Not cruelly, but coldly, like an analyst disappointed in a failed investment. My father, who rarely raised his voice, simply didn't speak to me for weeks. Aunt Diane declared at brunch that I was going through a phase, and Bradley made jokes about me becoming the family's starving artist mascot. The only person who didn't lecture me was Grandpa Walter. He wasn't overly affectionate. He didn't coddle or hand out praise like candy. But once when I was 18 and had gotten into an arts residency in Berlin instead of applying to Yale, he called me to his office and gestured for me to sit. There was silence as he stared out the window, Manhattan's skyline gleaming behind him. Then he said, "Do you know what I admire about artists?" "Claire." I blinked, unsure if it was a trap. What they create, things the world didn't know it needed. That was it. No blessing, no check. Just that quiet acknowledgement and a faint smile. He never said much more about my work, never funded me, but he never interfered either. In the Whitmore world, that was the closest thing to an embrace. Over the years, our conversations were few but meaningful. Occasionally, a handwritten card arrived in my mailbox with comments about an exhibition or article he had read that featured me. Sometimes just a quote scribbled in his sharp handwriting, "Form reveals truth. Beauty without weight is decoration." I kept every one of them. Still, I couldn't pretend we were close. After my parents died in a skiing accident when I was 21, I felt more like a fringe member of the dynasty than a direct descendant. I moved into a cramped studio in Brooklyn, supported myself by selling pieces when I could, waitressing when I couldn't. No one from the family came to see my exhibitions. No one ever called. Except once, on my 27th birthday, when Grandpa left a message. Happy birthday. Claire, I heard your last piece made the Tribeca Review. Keep creating. That's your real equity. I cried when I heard that. Not because it was sentimental, but because it reminded me someone still saw me. Then, last month, he died. Heart failure. Peacefully. In his sleep. According to the press release Emma had drafted and sent out within 12 hours. The public tributes poured in hotelier, philanthropist, titan. Private condolences were fewer. No one really knew the man behind the empire, not even his children. I didn't plan to attend the will reading. What for? I hadn't spoken to most of the family in years. The last event I'd gone to was Bradley's engagement party, and I'd spent most of it on the balcony with a glass of wine and the caterers. My presence always felt like an anomaly, an off-key note in an orchestra of perfectly polished performers. But something tugged at me that morning. Not money. I had long accepted that I was the family anomaly and wouldn't be included in anything financially meaningful. What drew me there was something quieter. A sense of closure. Or maybe a final chance to see if Grandpa had ever truly meant those rare words of encouragement. I dressed in a black turtleneck and slacks, simple and neat, not designer, but respectful. As I walked into the sleek conference floor of Langston & Price LLP, I was met with glances that flitted over me like scanner beams. Emma wore navy Chanel, her heels echoing against the marble floor like punctuation marks. Bradley had on a Rolex that cost more than my entire apartment's contents. Aunt Diane, as usual, looked like she'd stepped out of a glossy magazine, sharp, composed, commanding. No one said hello. Emma gave me a nod. Bradley didn't bother. Aunt Diane offered a tight smile that was more like a smirk. I sat at the edge of the oval conference table, away from the cluster of heirs and executives. A junior associate offered coffee. I declined. At precisely 10:00 a.m., Mr. Langston entered, the firm's senior partner and my grandfather's longtime attorney. Tall, silver-haired, expression like granite. He nodded once, opened a thick folder, and began reading the will. The division of assets rolled out like a Broadway performance. Aunt Diane received a brownstone in Gramercy and a vacation compound in Aspen. Bradley got 25% voting shares in the Whitmore Group and control of hotel development. Emma was granted the PR arm of the company, a 6-figure salary, and use of the private jet for corporate travel. And then, to my granddaughter Claire Whitmore, I leave the sum of $10 US. The room paused, and then the laughter began. Soft at first, then more open. Bradley leaned back and let out a full-throated chuckle. $10, he said. What's she gonna do with that buy, Clay? Emma looked away, biting her lip. Aunt Diane's voice was low and syrupy. Maybe now you'll finally consider doing something practical, dear. I smiled, tightly. My heart pounded, but I didn't let it show. Of course. This was how it ended. I stayed until the final clause was read, then began gathering my bag. But before I could stand, Mr. Langston's voice cut across the room. Miss Whitmore, if you could stay behind a moment, please. Your grandfather left something for you, privately. Everything shifted. I stayed seated while the others filed out, their heels clicking like judgment across polished marble. Bradley gave me one last smirk, tossing his car keys from hand to hand. Emma offered a half-hearted take care, while Aunt Diane didn't say a word. She only glanced over her shoulder with the same look you'd give a scratch on a silk blouse in annoyance, not a person. When the door finally shut behind them, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt heavier, but less sharp. Mr. Langston exhaled quietly and leaned back in his leather chair. "I apologize for the theater," he said, reaching into a side drawer and pulling out a thick envelope. "Your grandfather was meticulous." I stared at the envelope. Cream-colored, wax-sealed, with my full name written in deliberate, unmistakable handwriting. Claire Elizabeth Whitmore. "That's his handwriting," I said quietly. "It is." Mr. Langston confirmed. "He wrote this 2 months before his passing. I was instructed to give it to you only after the public reading of the will was complete and the rest of the family had left. Why?" He studied me for a moment, as if deciding whether I was ready to hear the truth. "Because he wanted you to hear the family's reaction, unfiltered, without masks. He believed it would help. Contextualize what you're about to read." My heart thudded. Slowly, I broke the seal. The scent of parchment and ink hit me first, faint but nostalgic. I unfolded the letter. 5 handwritten pages in total. At the top of the first sheet, in his confident script, it read, "My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, it means the performance has concluded. Yes, I'm aware that leaving you $10 in the will publicly was cruel on the surface, but it was necessary. I needed you to see them clearly, even in writing." His tone was unmistakably his. I read in silence, the words tumbling through me like a storm. "You are, in fact, the sole majority beneficiary of my estate. 82% of my personal and corporate holdings are now yours. The rest, divided among the family today, amounts to less than a fifth. That was intentional. If I had left it all to you openly, they would have descended upon you like vultures, manipulating, bribing, coercing. You would have never known who truly valued you for who you are. But now you do. You've always been different. Claire, you didn't chase legacy, you created your own. While others fought over power, you chose expression, you chose honesty, and so I chose you." I felt my breath catch. My hands trembled. I looked up, stunned. "Is this real?" I asked. Mr. Langston gave a slow nod. "Everything he wrote in that letter is accurate. The shares, the holdings, the private accounts, all yours, pending signature." "Of course." I turned back to the letter. Mind spinning. "Included in your inheritance are the following: my personal penthouse at 55 Greenhurst in Tribeca. The key is enclosed in this envelope. A trust totaling $390 million in assets, liquid and equity combined. My controlling interest in Whitmore Holdings, which gives you voting power on all corporate matters. A lockbox. Number 217 at Whitmore Private Bank. The key to it is with Mr. Langston. Inside, you'll find documents and other things." I looked up again. A lockbox. Mr. Langston nodded and pulled out a small brass key from a second envelope. "It's in the vault at Whitmore Bank. Walter was very clear you were to go there alone. Within 1 week of receiving this, it was surreal. 1 minute, I had been the butt of a family joke. The next, I was apparently the majority shareholder of one of the most powerful hotel empires in the country. But more than the money, more than the status, it was the fact that he had seen me. He believed in me. Quietly. Completely. And he had planned this. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope. I wasn't ready to process it all yet. Why didn't he just tell me, I asked. He believed deeply in independence. Langston said he worried that if he helped you openly, he'd interfere with your authenticity. But in truth, I think he simply wanted to watch you soar without a net and was prepared to catch you if you ever fell. I blinked away tears. Langston stood. Would you like me to take you to the lockbox? Now I hesitated. No. Not yet. I need air. He handed me a slim folder. Everything you need is in here. Your name will begin appearing on official filings within a few weeks. Until then, This is confidential. I understand. And Claire, I paused at the door. He was very proud of you. That evening, I sat on my apartment floor, cross-legged, surrounded by clay dust and unanswered emails, staring at the envelope and the brass key. The $10 check, now absurd in its meaning, lay next to me, still folded in its sterile envelope like a ghost of humiliation. I couldn't frame it yet. I wasn't ready. I barely slept. The next day, I took a cab to Tribeca. 55 Greenhurst was nothing like I imagined. From the outside, it looked like a modest industrial building, one of those converted lofts with ivy growing up the brick. But inside, it was breathtaking. The doorman knew my name. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse, and there, lit by soft skylight and arranged with care, were dozens of my sculptures. Early work, later pieces, even ones I had sold anonymously years ago. All here, all mine. He had collected my art. He hadn't just left me wealth. He had built a world with my work in it. A world he kept secret from everyone else. I sank to my knees, overwhelmed, and for the first time in years, I sobbed not from grief or rage or isolation, but from gratitude. He hadn't abandoned me. He had been watching the whole time. And now, it was my turn to decide what to do with the empire he had quietly handed me. It took me 3 days to gather the nerve to visit the bank, not because I didn't believe it was real. The penthouse was real. The sculptures, my sculptures, lined the walls, gently lit by fixtures he must have personally installed, but I was afraid of what else he had left behind. Afraid that inside that lockbox was a burden I wasn't ready to carry. On the morning of the 3rd day, I pulled on a black coat, tied my hair back, and headed to Whitmore Private Bank. It was an unassuming building tucked between 2 limestone giants on Madison Avenue. No signs, no marble lions, just a polished brass plaque and a pair of heavy glass doors that opened automatically as I approached, the kind of place built for discretion. I gave my name at the front desk. The woman behind the counter, immaculately dressed, tapped a few keys and then looked up, expression softening. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "we've been expecting you. Right this way." That phrase, "we've been expecting you," sent a shiver down my spine. It felt like walking into a script someone else had written, and I was only now catching up on the lines. She escorted me through a secure elevator down to the vault level, where a private banker in a navy suit met me with the same reverent professionalism one might reserve for royalty or the dead. "Box 217, he said. "Your grandfather reserved a private room." The room was small, minimalist, soundproofed. The lockbox itself was built into the wall, sturdy, steel, unmarked except for the number. I took a breath and inserted the key. The mechanism gave a solid click, and the box slid out smoothly. Inside were several leather folders, a USB drive, a slim envelope, and resting on top, a single black notebook. I reached for the notebook first. The cover was soft and worn, with the initials WW etched into the bottom corner. Inside were sketches, not blueprints or floor plans. Art, detailed. Emotional drawings, figures, faces, cityscapes. Most were charcoal or pencil, some inked in bold strokes. My grandfather had been an artist, a hidden one. A page near the center caught my attention, a sketch of me, from the back, sculpting something in a sunlit studio. The detail was extraordinary, the curve of my shoulder, the way I hunch slightly when I work, even the clay smudge on my cheek. He had drawn me. A lump rose in my throat. Beneath the notebook was a letter. "Claire, if you've made it here, it means you've accepted the first truth that I saw you all along, that I supported you quietly, but completely. The notebook is a piece of me few people ever saw. You now carry that part forward. I was not only your collector, I was your witness. You gave shape to your soul through your hands. I did mine through silence. But no more silence. There were instructions inside the envelope. directing me to a storage unit address in Brooklyn, Gallery Vault. It was labeled. I recognized the name it was, where artists stored unsold or archived work. I had a small unit there myself. The key was taped inside the letter. That same afternoon, I went. The unit wasn't small. It was a converted industrial bay, massive, temperature-controlled, secure. The man at the front desk looked surprised when I handed him the access code. "You're Mr. Whitmore's granddaughter?" "Yes," I said. He nodded respectfully and led me down a long hall. When the door rolled open, I stepped into a private gallery. My gallery. Dozens, no, hundreds of my sculptures, sketches, prototypes, even abandoned pieces I thought were lost, arranged carefully, lovingly, like a museum. There was a bronze piece I had made at 22 and sold anonymously online for a few $100. I'd regretted letting it go. Now, here it was, centered beneath a spotlight. He had bought it. He had bought them all. A plaque on the wall read, "Art is the language of the unseen. This collection belongs to the artist, W.W." In the center of the room was a steel case. Inside, a set of documents, property deeds, equity certificates, a handwritten portfolio labeled "The Whitmore Foundation Redefined." That's when I realized this wasn't just an inheritance. It was a mission. My grandfather hadn't left me wealth to hoard. He had left me tools, a platform, a stage. He had created an entire infrastructure to support the very kind of work the rest of the family dismissed. He was an artist trapped in a world of capital, and he had chosen me to finish what he never could begin. I spent the next week in silence, reading, sketching, revisiting old sculptures I had long thought forgotten. I turned the penthouse into a living studio, half workspace, half sanctuary. I opened drawers only to find notebooks filled with Walter's notes on art, philosophy, architecture, quotes scrawled in the margins. "A building is a sculpture people live inside. Legacy isn't what you leave, it's what you enable. Beauty without purpose is decoration. Purpose without beauty is tyranny." Everywhere I turned, I found echoes of the man no one in my family truly knew. And slowly, I began to understand my next step. On the 8th day, Mr. Langston called. "Claire," he said, "the SEC filings will be public in 2 weeks. Your name will be released as the majority shareholder of Whitmore Holdings. You'll need to decide how and when to inform the rest of the family." I looked around the penthouse, then at the black notebook sitting open beside me. "They're not going to take it well," I said. "No," Langston said. After a pause, "They're not—" I closed my eyes, took a deep breath. "Then let's make it count." The invitation came wrapped in cream cardstock with raised gold lettering, classic Whitmore branding, polished, expensive, unapologetically grand. "Family council dinner to honor Walter Whitmore's memory and future legacy. Hosted by Diane Whitmore. RSVP required. Black tie." I stared at it on my kitchen counter for a full hour before deciding to attend. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to stay in my studio, surrounded by my tools and silence. But another part, stronger, steadier, knew that showing up wasn't just a formality, it was strategy. This wasn't about proving anything to them. This was about watching them squirm before they even realized the game had changed. The Whitmore estate in Westchester hadn't changed in years. A sweeping Georgian mansion with endless marble floors, oil paintings of ancestors who all wore the same grim expression, and servants who moved like ghosts. I arrived 15 minutes late fashionably, deliberately, for the first time in years. I felt no need to apologize for my presence. I wore a tailored black dress, minimal jewelry, and no logo in sight. I wasn't here to display power. I was power. Bradley opened the door. He looked momentarily surprised to see me, but quickly recovered into his default smirk. "Claire," he said, stepping aside. "Didn't expect you. That makes 2 of us," I replied lightly. Inside, The parlor buzzed with low conversation, champagne flutes, and veiled hierarchy games. Emma stood by the piano, laughing with two minor board members. Aunt Diane was near the fireplace, dominating a circle of men with her signature steel-laced charm. As I entered, the energy shifted. I felt it ripple, like a drop of ink in clear water. "Claire," Diane said smoothly, approaching with a glass of wine. "I'm glad you decided to join us." She kissed the air near my cheek, then pulled back, studying me. "You look, well, I am," I said, taking the wine from her hand. "Thanks." Her gaze flicked to my neckline, no necklace, to my wrist, no designer watch, to my posture taller than she remembered. "We were just talking about the company's upcoming expansion into Latin America," she said. "Bradley's leading the portfolio now." "Interesting," I said, sipping. "Grandpa mentioned a few things about that last year. Something about poor ROI projections for Panama." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded. Walter always had his opinions. So did I. I thought. Dinner was served in the formal dining room. The table stretched long enough to seat 25. Only 12 places were set, meaning only those who mattered were invited. I noticed the symbolism immediately. The vacant seats, once Walter's advisors or extended family, had been trimmed, consolidated, controlled. Diane sat at the head. I was placed to her left. That alone sent a murmur through the room. Emma blinked. Bradley scowled. "Shall we begin?" Diane asked, lifting her glass. "To Walter, and to the legacy we will carry forward." Everyone murmured agreement, glasses clinked, then soup was served. I stayed quiet through the first 2 courses, listening, absorbing. The language hadn't changed: profit margins, brand expansions, quarterly volatility, but the tone had. It was more performative now, more self-congratulatory. Walter was gone, and everyone was trying to fill the vacuum, or so they thought. Midway through dinner, Diane turned to me. "So, Claire, what are you working on these days, still sculpting?" I smiled. "Yes." Bradley snorted. "Must be nice to play with clay all day while the rest of us carry the family name." I didn't take the bait. "I'd say creating something from nothing is carrying something pretty important." He leaned back. "Sculpting doesn't pay dividends. Neither do ego-driven hotel expansions with negative margins," I said, sweetly. The silence that followed was delicious. Emma cleared her throat. "Well, I've actually seen Claire's work featured recently. There was a show at a gallery in Soho last month, wasn't there?" "There was," I said, "but it's been postponed. Why new opportunities came up." Diane's fork paused midair. Such as I smiled. "You'll find out soon enough." She narrowed her eyes, the way a general might assess battlefield terrain. Calculating. "Is there something we should know?" "Claire?" I leaned forward slightly, wine glass in hand. "Let's just say Grandpa had a more complex definition of legacy than we all assumed." Bradley opened his mouth, but Emma beat him to it. "Are you saying he left you something beyond?" The $10, a hush fell over the table. I held her gaze. "I'm saying I'm not here to be pitied or ignored." Diane set her wine down slowly. "Claire, if there's something you're implying, it's best we clear the air now." "No," I said, finishing my wine. "I think it's best we wait." After dinner, the guests drifted toward the drawing room for coffee and digestifs. Bradley cornered me near the fireplace. "What game are you playing?" he asked, tone low, smile forced. "No game," I said. "I just finally stopped pretending I wasn't in the room." He stepped closer. "If Grandpa left you anything meaningful, you'd have said so by now. Would I, whatever it is. If you think you can walk in here and take control," I raised a hand. "Relax. Bradley, you're not in my crosshairs. But you are up to something." I smiled. Why does that scare you? He didn't answer, just stalked off. Emma approached quietly, arms crossed. I knew there was more to that $10 thing. She said, "You didn't flinch." I was trained to absorb humiliation without reaction. Her expression softened. "I used to think you were weak. I'm not." I said, "I was just waiting." A pause. "Is it true?" she asked. "Did he leave you something? Big?" I didn't answer, just looked her in the eye. She nodded slowly, then walked away more thoughtful than before. On my way out, Diane called after me. "I don't know what you think you're doing," she said from the threshold of the hall. "But remember, the Whitmore name comes with expectations." I turned. And maybe it's time those expectations changed. When I stepped into the cold night air, I felt it for the first time, not victory, not yet, but leverage. The family still thought they held the throne. They hadn't realized the crown had already changed hands, and I wasn't here to sit on their throne. I was building something else entirely. After that family dinner, I disappeared. Not literally. I still answered calls from Langston, reviewed the filings, spoke to the executive transition team at Whitmore Holdings. But I didn't attend any more family gatherings. I didn't respond to Emma's texts or Bradley's passive-aggressive emails pretending to check in. Instead, I focused on construction, not just the physical kind, but something deeper, something legacy-shaping. Walter had left me wealth, yes, but he'd also left me a question: what will you do with it that matters? The first step was the Whitmore Foundation. It already existed. Of course, a generic charitable arm that had for years funneled safe, tax-friendly donations to museums and causes that looked good in annual reports. But Walter had left me a revised charter proposal, handwritten, bold, focused. It was titled Whitmore Foundation, Artistic Reinvention Proposal, confidential, Claire's eyes only. Inside was a manifesto. Direct funding to emerging artists from marginalized backgrounds. Create subsidized studio spaces in high-rent cities like New York and LA. Support art education in public schools. Provide mental health stipends for working artists. Commission public sculptures in neglected communities. At the bottom, scrawled in his all-caps handwriting, "Let them carve their way through the world, like you did." I assembled a team. Not legacy board members, not lawyers or investment strategists, artists, educators. One retired community organizer who had run a nonprofit out of a basement in Harlem for 2 decades. People who knew creation, not just curation. Langston raised an eyebrow when I told him I'd be replacing the board. "Legally sound," he said, "but you'll ruffle feathers." I hope so. The second step was reclaiming the gallery vault. The private art storage Walter had used to collect my work, and I soon discovered the work of others. Photographs by names I didn't recognize. Sculptures by artists who'd vanished into obscurity. Paintings unsigned, dated, and raw with talent. Walter had spent the final years of his life quietly collecting what others overlooked. And now it was mine. I opened the vault to the public, transforming the space into a free admission gallery called The Archive. Every 3 months, we'd rotate a new exhibition featuring works Walter had collected alongside new artists selected through an open call process. No name-dropping, no prestige entry barrier, just art. Real, urgent, human art. I designed it to feel like walking into someone's soul. Visitors could trace lines from my grandfather's hidden drawings to mine, to someone else's street art photographed on a brick wall in Queens. It was messy. It was emotional. It was alive. Meanwhile, the media caught wind of something brewing. It started with whispers in the financial blogs Whitmore Holdings majority stake, now under Claire Whitmore, the sculptor. Then an arts magazine did a profile on the archive. Then a headline exploded on a major site: "The $10 heiress is reshaping a $1 billion empire, one artist at a time." And just like that, I was no longer invisible. Bradley called. I let it go to voicemail. Then Emma, I picked up. Claire, she began, cautiously. I saw the articles, the foundation, the gallery. It's impressive. Thank you, I said. Pause. But why didn't you tell us any of it? Because you weren't listening. No one was. I'm listening now. A beat passed between us. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Then Diane called. This time, I answered. Claire, I think we need to have a conversation, she said, her tone crisp. You've made some significant moves. The board has questions. I've answered them, I replied. I've met every legal and procedural requirement. You blindsided your own family? No, I said. You dismissed me. Diane, repeatedly, I didn't blindside you. You refused to look. Don't let this go to your head. Legacy requires more than idealism. It requires vision, I said. And I inherited that too. A week later, I received an anonymous package at the penthouse. Inside was a small bronze paperweight shaped like an open hand. No note. But I knew. It was Walter. It was a piece I'd made when I was 19, never sold, never exhibited. Just one of my early student experiments in balance and tension. He must have saved it all this time. I placed it on my desk next to his black notebook. They looked good side by side. By the end of that month, I had launched the first initiative of the new foundation, the Whitmore Emerging Voices Fund, a $10 million annual grant program for artists under 30 with a focus on public art installations. Applications flooded in. One letter stood out handwritten. Like Walter's letters to me, a 23-year-old welder from Detroit. No degree, no gallery shows. Just raw talent, gritty passion, and photographs of incredible scrap metal sculptures she created in her father's old garage. She ended her letter with, I just want someone to see what I see before the world teaches me not to look. I cried when I read that, because that's exactly what Walter had done for me. At night, I'd walk through the penthouse. Every corner still whispered with his presence, his sketches, his collected works, his voice in the form of ideas, unfinished and unspoken. And every night, I'd pass the $10 check, now framed on my wall, a reminder not of rejection but of resilience. He hadn't given me wealth to make me powerful. He had given me possibility and the chance to redefine what it meant to be a Whitmore. The Whitmore Shareholders Gala had always been an exclusive spectacle. Every year, held in the gilded ballroom of the Whitmore Grand in Midtown Manhattan. It served as both a celebration and performance, a declaration of continued dominance in the luxury market. Media swarmed outside, investors glided inside, and the family paraded like royalty through a hall of mirrors that reflected nothing but prestige. This year was different. This year I was on the inside, not just invited, but at the head of the storm. The moment I stepped into the ballroom, conversations paused mid-sentence. I could feel them eyes turning, whispers forming, the subtle weight of collective scrutiny pressing in. It had been 3 weeks since the SEC filings confirmed the transfer of controlling interest in Whitmore Holdings to Claire Elizabeth Whitmore. 3 weeks since headlines declared that the family's black sheep sculptor now sat atop a billion-dollar empire. Some called it poetic. Others, a mistake. I called it inevitable. I didn't dress to impress. I dressed to disrupt, an angular midnight blue gown sculpted like one of my own pieces, structured, minimal, confident. My hair was tied back simply, revealing a single statement piece, a necklace made of cast bronze, shaped like interlocking hands, one of my early works. It wasn't a tiara, it was a signature. Emma approached me first, wearing soft ivory and her best public relations smile. You look incredible, she said. Genuinely. There's a Vanity Fair reporter here tonight. I think they want to do a feature. I nodded. Let's see if they still want it after tonight. A flicker of worry crossed her face. Claire, you're not planning to, but I was already walking away. Diane stood beneath the central chandelier, encircled by donors and board members like a queen in exile refusing to concede. She wore navy her armor and her gaze swept the room like radar. When she saw me, she smiled. Too wide, too tight. "Claire," she said coolly, stepping forward. "You've certainly stirred the pot." "Sometimes," I replied. "You have to break the mold before it hardens." She linked her arm through mine with practiced grace. "A few of the old guard are uneasy. They're not sure what to expect from you tonight. Then I suggest they listen carefully." Her smile cracked just slightly. At 800 sharp, the lights dimmed. A hush fell. The host, a graying vice president who'd been with the company longer than I'd been alive, stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. As many of you know, this is the first gala since the passing of our founder, Walter Whitmore. And in his absence, we welcome a new era of leadership. Please join me in introducing our majority shareholder and newest member of the board, Ms. Claire Whitmore." Applause, scattered, hesitant. I climbed the steps slowly, deliberately. Every inch of the stage belonged to me, and I was ready to use it. "Thank you," I began, standing alone under the spotlight. "Not just for your applause, but for your silence. It tells me more than words ever could." A few uncomfortable chuckles. I didn't smile. "When I was younger, I was told I had the wrong kind of hands to carry the Whitmore name. Not steady enough for numbers. Not firm enough for negotiations. Too soft. Too stained with clay." I paused. "Let them absorb that. And yet, those hand-sculpted pieces that now sit in museums, those hands built galleries, and those hands are now signing off on the future of this company." More murmurs. Eyes widened. Some jaws tightened. "I'm not here to dazzle you with financial reports or quote profit margins. Others can do that better. I'm here because Walter Whitmore, my grandfather, believed that legacy isn't built on balance sheets. It's built on vision." I reached into my pocket and held up a check. A single slip of paper. $10. Gasps rippled across the room. Phones came out. Flashbulbs blinked. "This," I said, holding the check aloft, "was all I was publicly left in his will. And it was all I needed." I turned it around so they could see the signature, Walter Whitmore, because that check wasn't an insult. It was a message. And the message was, this value is not defined by what you're given. It's defined by what you create. Now, silence. Total, undivided, wrapped. I own 82% of Whitmore Holdings. I continued. Not because I asked for it, not because I earned it the traditional way, but because my grandfather believed in potential that doesn't always wear a tie. My decisions moving forward will be guided by that belief. We are not just a hospitality company, we are a brand that shapes experiences, cities, communities, and it's time we began acting like it. Polite applause now, real interest. People were leaning in. I'm announcing tonight the creation of the Whitmore Cultural Initiative, a company-funded partnership with the Whitmore Foundation to bring public art installations, artist residencies, and creative spaces into every major city where we operate hotels. We will house not just tourists, but culture. Even Diane blinked. I didn't stop, and that's only the beginning. I walked off stage as the room erupted into buzz, half admiration, half alarm. Bradley intercepted me near the champagne table. "Are you serious?" he hissed. "You just turned a shareholder event into an art exhibit pitch." "No," I said calmly. "I just turned it into a future. One with meaning." He scoffed. "Investors don't care about murals. They care about returns." "Then they'll be thrilled," I replied. "Studies show public art improves neighborhood value, tourism interest, and brand affinity. You'd know that if you read more than the revenue column." He flushed. "You don't know what you're doing." "No," I said, stepping closer. "You just don't understand doing things differently." After the speech, people who had ignored me for years lined up to talk. An investor wanted to know more about the cultural initiative. A gallery owner asked to collaborate. A journalist requested an exclusive. Emma found me by the exit. "You were brilliant," she said, slightly breathless. "I didn't think you had it in you." "I did," I said. "You just weren't looking." She nodded. "I'm sorry. For all of it. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. Outside, the city air was cool. The streets were loud. Life, unfiltered. I walked a few blocks, still buzzing, still vibrating with everything that had just happened. Then my phone lit up. A message from Langston. "Your grandfather would have been proud tonight." I smiled for real. I could almost hear Walter's voice, create something the world didn't know it needed, and tonight I had not just art, not just a speech, but space. Space for a new kind of legacy, one no longer built behind closed doors but in full view. In the days following the gala, the world moved quickly, but I moved slower. News outlets ran headlines like "Sculptor-turned-CEO Claire Whitmore's radical redirection of $1 billion legacy. From $10 to total control heiress reshapes empire with visionary arts plan." Some praised me as a breath of fresh air. Others accused me of being naive, an idealist with too much power. I didn't care about either. I wasn't interested in public opinion. I was interested in authenticity and impact. Bradley, predictably, tried to undermine me. He called emergency board meetings, citing stability concerns, but Langston stood firm. The trust was airtight, my shares were irrevocable, and the more noise Bradley made, the more obvious it became that he had nothing but resentment in his arsenal. Emma, surprisingly, shifted. She started showing up to foundation meetings not to critique, but to listen. She asked questions about our grant application process. She requested to meet some of the artists we funded. One afternoon, I invited her to tour the vault. She stared at a large welded steel piece made by a 22-year-old from Oakland and whispered, "I've never felt anything like this in a Whitmore building before." That was enough for now. Diane went quiet. Her lawyers went quiet. The entire structure she'd built on image and control began to look brittle in the light. I stayed grounded in creation. Each morning, I sculpted sometimes in the penthouse, sometimes at the newly renovated foundation workspace downtown. The clay kept me honest. It didn't care about net worth. It didn't care about press. It simply responded to presence. And in those quiet hours, I began thinking about Walter again, not as a tycoon or a benefactor, but as a man, a hidden artist, someone who saw me because he had once tried to be me. I started sorting through more of his journals. There were boxes I hadn't opened yet stored in a locked cabinet in the penthouse study, marked with a sharp red W. Inside were dozens of sketchbooks, old ones, dating back to the 70s and 80s. He had signed them not as Walter Whitmore, but with a single initial W. What struck me first was their vulnerability. These weren't blueprints or composed technical studies. These were raw, emotional, portraits of street vendors, studies of factory workers' hands, a child sitting alone on a swing set, a mother holding a protest sign. Walter had seen things the rest of the family never looked for. Then, one afternoon, I opened the final notebook in the stack and stopped breathing. It was a self-portrait, charcoal on parchment, rough, unfinished. Walter's face, older, more worn than any photograph I'd ever seen. His eyes weren't quite meeting the viewer's gaze. They looked past into some unseen distance, and beneath the sketch, he had written just one line, "For the self I never got to be." My throat tightened. He had never shown this to anyone. This wasn't just art, it was confession. He had lived two lives, the man the world saw, and the artist he buried beneath custom suits and business deals. And in choosing me, he had finally brought that buried part into the light. I framed the self-portrait and hung it in the center of the archive. No label, no fanfare, just truth. Visitors started asking about it. Some guessed it was mine. Others asked if it was an anonymous artist's work. I always gave the same answer. It's someone who understood legacy. By spring, the Whitmore Foundation's Emerging Voices program had accepted its first cohort. 20 young artists from across the country received funding, space, and mentorship. One of them, a trans muralist from Texas, cried when I handed her the grant check in person. "No one ever gave me anything without asking me to shrink first," she said. "You don't have to shrink anymore," I replied. Neither did I. Michael came back into my life around then. We had met once before, briefly, when he was a journalist covering the archive's launch. At the time, I'd been too submerged in logistics and self-doubt to connect with anyone. Now, months later, he emailed, "Still building something beautiful." I replied, "Want to come see for yourself?" He did. And then he came again. He wasn't dazzled by the penthouse or the articles. He didn't care about the foundation's endowment. He cared about the stories behind the pieces, about the people whose work lined the gallery walls. When I showed him Walter's self-portrait, he was silent for a long time. Then he said, "This is the most honest thing in the building." I nodded. It's why everything else exists. One evening, Michael and I sat on the penthouse balcony, watching the city glow like a galaxy spilled across concrete. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. Inheriting all of this, I thought for a moment. "No," I said. "But I think I used to wish for a different kind of inheritance. One where I got to know Walter earlier, where he could have been this version of himself out loud, and not in the margins." Michael nodded. "Sometimes we inherit silence, and we have to turn it into something that speaks." That stayed with me. So did he. In the press, people still call me a disruptor, a radical, a renegade heiress. But I don't think of myself that way. I think of myself as someone who was laughed at for a $10 inheritance, then discovered it wasn't a joke. It was a doorway, a test, and an invitation to create something more meaningful than gold-plated legacies and quarterly projections. Something lasting. Something human. The 1-year anniversary of my grandfather's passing arrived on a spring morning full of light. No grief. No thunderclouds. Just the sun rising over Manhattan, casting long streaks of gold through the windows of the penthouse, his penthouse. Now mine, where his past and my future had found a strange, beautiful truce. The foundation team had been preparing for weeks. This wasn't just another gala or exhibition. This was the unveiling, the final piece of Walter Whitmore's legacy, the version of him the world never knew. We called it W the Hidden Eye, a full-scale public exhibition dedicated to Walter's private artwork sketchbooks, charcoal studies, inked street portraits, and most centrally, his self-portrait, the one I had discovered months ago, the one that had reframed everything. The gallery space was transformed to mirror the evolution of Walter's creative life, from tightly drawn early pieces with rigid lines to looser, emotionally driven works filled with vulnerability and risk. And woven between it all were my own sculptures, displayed not as tribute, but as conversation. 2 generations, 2 hidden artists, now side by side. The opening night was invitation only, but the waiting list was longer than any previous exhibition the archive had hosted. The art community was curious. The corporate world was skeptical. And the Whitmore family, well, they were cornered. Emma arrived first, alone. No PR entourage this time. She lingered the longest in the East 84th Street series, Walter's black and white sketches of working-class New Yorkers in the 1980s. He was seeing the city. She whispered, not just owning parts of it. I nodded. He always did. He just couldn't show it. Emma looked at me. But you can... Bradley showed up half an hour late. He walked briskly through the space, his eyes flickering from piece to piece with a kind of wounded disbelief. This wasn't who he was, he muttered, standing in front of the self-portrait. I stepped up beside him. No, I said softly. This is who he wasn't allowed to be. Bradley swallowed hard, jaw tight. He left all of this to you, he said. He left all of this to anyone willing to see it. I just got there first. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize either. But when he left, he paused at the final sculpture, my own, and lingered longer than I expected. Diane didn't come, but I didn't need her to, because this wasn't about their approval anymore. This was about witnessing, at the end of the evening. I gave a short speech not from a stage, but standing in front of Walter's self-portrait. Most people knew my grandfather as a man of business. I began, but he was also a man of seeing, of documenting, of feeling more than he could safely express. I gestured to the surrounding work. This art is not a side note to his legacy. It is his legacy. The part that survived boardrooms and branding. The part he entrusted me to reveal, not just to preserve him, but to liberate myself. I felt the words settle around the room like truth gently dropped. And now, I pass that legacy on to all of you. Not as something to protect, but as something to build on. The exhibition would remain open to the public indefinitely. We arranged educational programming, artist talks, and a permanent grant in Walter's name, the W Fund, awarded annually to an artist who works in secret, who creates outside the lines of recognition and acclaim. It wasn't just about lifting voices. It was about honoring silence and what lives beneath it. A week later, I walked the empty gallery alone. I stopped in front of the final installation, a small space enclosed by translucent silk walls, inside which stood my grandfather's original drafting table from his private study. On the surface, encased in glass, were two side-by-side objects, the $10 check, and a handwritten note of mine, dated from years ago. When I'd sent him a thank you after my first gallery showing, I'm going to keep trying, even if no one looks, because that's what you do when you believe in something. Walter had kept that note in his drawer until the day he died. Now, it sat beside his insult transformed. They weren't opposites. They were echoes. Michael arrived quietly, as he always did. He stood beside me for a long moment before speaking. "You changed something here," he said. "I didn't mean to change anything," I said. "I just stopped hiding. That's how change starts," he replied. Someone decides not to be invisible anymore. That night, we walked along the East River, watching the lights flicker across the water. I keep thinking about what it means to inherit something. I said, money, power, even pain, and what we're supposed to do with it. Michael tilted his head. "What have you decided?" I looked out at the skyline. "That inheritance isn't what we carry, it's what we leave in our wake. Not money, not buildings, but the space we make for others to stand taller, to speak louder, to become more fully themselves." He didn't reply. He didn't have to. A year ago, they laughed at me. For $10. 10 symbolic dollars that they thought defined my worth. Now those $10 are framed in a gallery visited by thousands. Now, they are a symbol of something far greater. Not revenge, not domination, but liberation. For me, for Walter, for anyone who's ever been told they're not enough because they chose a different path. And if you asked me now what I inherited, I'd say I inherited a blank canvas, a block of stone, a studio full of silence just waiting to be shaped. And I have every intention of sculpting something they never saw coming, something that lasts, something that matters.